As a professional wrestling fan, and as someone who is in and around the professional wrestling world here in the UK, I'm always given the same spiel when I tell someone that I'm in this world, or I watch wrestling in general. And that is, don't you know that it's fake? In years prior, I probably would have argued this point, but in general, I just pretend like my whole world has been shattered just to see what kind of reaction I get out of them. Of course I know it's fake. I do that shit. If I, myself, hit a leg drop on someone, an actual, real-life leg drop onto someone's head, I'm fucking killing them. I'm a fat fuck. All joking aside though, pro wrestling is not something that should be scoffed at. It's a performance, of course. But it's also an agreement. It's an agreement that you are going to step into the ring with another living person, and you are going to take that person's life into your hands, and you're going to take care of them throughout the duration of the match, and they are agreeing to the exact same thing. That whole mantra though, yeah, that didn't apply to a certain wrestler from the late 90s, early 2000s. That wrestler, infamous as he is, that wrestler was known as New Jack. New Jack, for lack of a better term, didn't give two shits. This is a man who once got an injury so bad that he tried to murder the person that did it. Granted, in another wrestling capacity, but still, he tried to end the life of the person who gave him a pretty serious head injury. He also showed up to an independent wrestling show with a crossbow. While it wasn't loaded, this is New Jack we're talking about, so there's every opportunity for him to just pull that string back, load up a bolt, and just start aiming at people. Not necessarily saying he's going to shoot, but he could aim. Plus, you just absolutely just don't know with New Jack. In essence, New Jack things could happen. So what's one of the things that you could do that would really piss off New Jack? Well, you could face him in the ring, just after being backstage and acting like Mr. Big Shot when really you're greener than grass. Bringing us to today's story of Comfort in Death and Darkness. Fair warning, this story contains intentional bodily harm. This is the story of the ECW mass transit incident. November 23rd, 1996. We're just 2 years and 3 months removed from the infamous Shane Douglas throwing down of the NWA World's Championship title. Eastern Championship Wrestling is dead and Extreme Championship Wrestling is on the rise. The company was hot. It was red hot. It was making waves, and it was becoming very, very quickly the most sought after wrestling promotion just after WWF and WCW. The thing that drew audiences to ECW was that it was just so dramatically different from WWF and WCW at the time. Heck, even Kurt Angle, yes, that Kurt Angle, Olympic gold medalist, broken freaking neck Kurt Angle, he almost joined ECW before WWF. The thing that made Angle run from ECW though was a storyline involving Sandman and Raven, and if you know where this is going. Sandman and Raven's story was hotter than everything at the time, literally the hottest thing going in wrestling. They actually brought their real life children into the thing. There was a moment where Sandman's child was stood in the ring wearing a replica of Raven's signature leather jacket, and he did the Raven taunt. And Sandman was just devastated. This was cutting edge storytelling. Sandman and Raven were just beating each other with weapon after weapon after weapon. And it kind of culminated in Raven crucifying Sandman. Did you hear me? I said he crucified him. Kurt Angle, the ever good all-American boy that he was, well, he was extremely offended by this, and he decided to just turn tail and refuse to work with ECW because of how blasphemous this Angle was. He would sign with WWF soon after. ECW though was the place where you could find all of those incredible storylines. And you'd also get that new, fresh, hardcore attitude and matches to go along with it. People were clamoring for this sort of thing. People were bored with seeing the same matches over and over and over again. ECW had everything that you could want and more. Leading us to November 23rd, 1996. ECW would run a very small house show, and it was not to be broadcast. That's what house shows are. If you hear anything in wrestling say house show, it's a live event that's supposed to be, unrecorded. This house show would emanate from the Wonderland Ballroom in Revere, Massachusetts. The show was originally scheduled to feature a tag team match. That match was going to be consisted between, on one team, Axl Rotten and Devon Dudley versus the Gangsters, Mustafa Saeed and New Jack. Unfortunately though, due to a big family emergency, Axl Rotten could not attend the show. He didn't no-show, he did let Paul Heyman know ahead of time, but Heyman was now down a body. Now I can tell you for an absolute fact that running a wrestling show is one of the most stressful things I've ever done in my life. When a wrestler doesn't show up, panic stations everywhere. It turns into a logistical nightmare because you need to try and fill someone in, you need to try and make sure that the crowd is going to go home still feeling like they got their money's worth if there's someone on the card that's missing that, you know, people paid to see. That's why they always say, if you're going to go to a wrestling show, as a professional wrestler, bring your gear, because you never know what's going to happen. And of course, with Axl Rotten not being on this show, there's like a big gaping hole in the card now. In steps a young professional wrestler by the name of Mass Transit. He would volunteer to take Rotten's place. Mass Transit, with his father vouching for him, would let Paul Heyman know that Mass Transit was 23 years old. Or 20. Or 19. It really depended on who Transit was talking to at the time. They also told Heyman that Mass Transit was a graduate of Killer Kowalski's training school. Now, Heyman had had dealings with Kowalski's graduates in the past. It's fairly well known that Killer Kowalski's training school was very difficult to actually graduate from. Not as difficult as the Heart Dungeon, but still, it was pretty difficult. And this is a guy that actually managed to train someone like, I don't know, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who was more commonly known these days as Terrorize it. Triple H. It's Triple H. There was just one teeny weeny little itty bitty problem though. This guy called Mass Transit, yeah, he lied. Eric Cullis, that was the actual guy's name. He wasn't in his early 20s. He wasn't trained by Killer Kowalski. In fact, he was basically not trained at all. Cullis was a near 300-pound, 17-year-old male who was completely untrained in the art form of professional wrestling. And this is a kid who was about to go into the ring with the absolutely unhinged New Jack. What would happen next would be nothing short of a massacre. Mass Transit and Devon Dudley would head to the ring, and in the footage that is available, you can clearly see that Transit is trying his best to make no friends with the fans. He's getting heat, as would say. The gangsters then hit the ring, and with them, they bring a slew of weaponry. There was one key difference between Devon Dudley and Mass Transit, and that was that Devon Dudley was actually a respected member of the ECW locker room. Transit, as you can probably guess, was not, and he wasn't doing himself any favours before the match, giving off some very bad vibes. He just completely ignored locker room etiquette. This is a guy that Heyman hired as a jobber. A jobber's role in professional wrestling is to just make the other guy look good. You don't really get much offense in when you're a jobber. That's why it's generally referred to as enhancement talent. You're there to enhance the other person. So when Transit tried to take it upon himself to say how the match should go and try to organise things, New Jack really saw this as this rookie overstepping the mark. However, there was one request that Transit made that New Jack was going to be more than happy to accommodate. Transit told New Jack that he should blade him. Getting colour in professional wrestling vernacular basically means bleeding. However, the blade job that New Jack would perform on young Eric Cullis was... This isn't hyperbole. It was one of the worst blade jobs in professional wrestling history. In the footage that's available, we see New Jack start to fight Devon Dudley through the crowd. Devon just disappears, and the camera makes its way back to the ring. In the ring, we see Syed holding Cullis and punching him in the head. Nothing new there, really, except we then see New Jack enter the ring holding a crutch, and he hits Cullis with this crutch as hard as he possibly can. He lifts the crutch above his head and slams it as hard as he possibly can across Cullis's back, and the crutch just disintegrates. It's like hanging off. He follows it up with one more shot from the crutch to the back, and now the crutch is completely in two. New Jack just tosses the crutch to a side and just starts looking around the ring looking for a new weapon. He finds one and just absolutely drives it into his back again. Next, New Jack grabs a trash can that housed the weaponry that they brought to the ring at the start of the match. New Jack empties its contents all over the ring, and then he finds what he'd been looking for. A toaster. This is ridiculous. You heard that correctly. A toaster. Cullis is hit so hard right in the forehead by this toaster from New Jack that the toaster just basically crumbles in his hand. Cullis hits the mat, and then we finally see Devon start coming back into the ring, and it's weird because it seems like he's not really trying to make that much of an effort to get in the ring. I mean, it doesn't help that Mustafa Saeed is like kicking him off the apron, but still, it doesn't seem like Devon is making a conscious effort to actually enter into the action. It's almost as if Devon himself was pissed off with the antics of Cullis backstage. And it would appear that he left his tag team partner right at the mercy of New Jack. And New Jack don't do mercy. Devon hits the floor just after Saeed has kicked him in the face. And New Jack looks on the ground and picks up another weapon. And he picks it up and he holds it up for the crowd to see. The crowd starts going wild. And you're thinking, what's he got? Because from this footage, you can't really see what he's got. What New Jack was holding in his hand was a surgical scalpel. New Jack sits Cullis up, and with scalpel in hand, he starts just carving into the kid's forehead. And he's doing this for a good 5 seconds before suddenly Cullis screams out in actual agony. The 17-year-old rolls onto his front, and that's when you see a pool of blood, dark red blood, just start to pool on the mat. As ProWrestlingStories.com so eloquently put it, fans at ringside discovered the meaning of arterial spray. A simple blade job obviously wasn't enough for New Jack. This guy was pissed off, and he ended up cutting far deeper into Cullis' head than he ever should have. And then to make matters worse, New Jack and Saeed just start to freaking wail on this guy. They hit him in the head over and over and over again, even though this guy is bleeding profusely. Now, if you've never seen Mustafa Saeed before, that's this guy. Yeah, he's an absolute tank. Doesn't look like much could fit as that guy, which is probably why he then decides to try and scoop slam a near 300-pound boy and nearly drops him on his head. All that weight coming down on his neck, that would have surely just snapped it in two, but thankfully he didn't. He landed on his upper back. But on the other side of the frame, we can see New Jack climbing up to the top turnbuckle, and in his hand he has a steel chair. And then he flies through the air, chair hooked into his right hand, and he just absolutely plummets on top of Cullis. Now, all of New Jack's body lands firmly in the center of Cullis's like sternum. The chair, however, just gets freaking slammed into his head. Now, normally with wrestling shots from weapons, you can see them sort of pull back the sledgehammer shot. They like hit the chair on the floor rather than on the person. But on this one, they full unadulterated smashed that chair into this guy's head. Again, who is bleeding profusely. New Jack then proceeds to like pin Cullis. But it's weird because there's no referee. It becomes very apparent at that point that there is no referee. The crowd counts the 3 count, and New Jack just seems to walk away as if he's won. I don't even think this was a match. As New Jack walks away from the broken body of Cullis, the camera zooms into the face of Cullis, and you can literally see blood squirting out of Cullis's forehead. This is one of the things where if someone told me about this, I wouldn't believe that there was quite that much blood, but no, on this occasion, blood was literally squirting from his head and landing on the canvas. Medical personnel, and by that I mean one singular nurse, runs into the ring and tries to stop the blood flow. While this is happening, New Jack decides to grab a microphone. He then proceeds to scream the following into the microphone to the ECW crowd. I don't care if the motherfucker dies. He's white. I don't like white people. I don't like people from Boston. I'm oh God. I'm the wrong N-word to fuck with. Yeah, for the time, New Jack was a whole nother level of hardcore. No, actually, scratch that. New Jack was just a fucking crazy person who happened to find his way into professional wrestling, then a different type of life. It should be noted that a lot of people consider that New Jack's like personality in wrestling is all an act. A very, very real act, but an act nonetheless. People have said that behind the scenes, New Jack's actually a really articulate guy. He just has a little bit of a mean streak. Well, a huge mean streak, actually. That mean streak was clear as day and on display for everybody in Massachusetts that day. In the footage, you can actually hear the father of Cullis, Stephen Cullis, like screaming for this to stop. He's He's literally screaming these things from the crowd. It's as if the guy who's filming has Stephen Cullis to his back. But here's the stupid thing. Stephen Cullis vouched for his son. He corroborated that his son was indeed both old enough and had actually graduated from the wrestling school of Killer Kowalski. Obviously nobody at the time knew that New Jack was basically going to commit a felony, but this was the result what we ended up with. This ended up being a dark, if not one of the darkest days in ECW history, because Extreme Championship Wrestling, for as young of a company as it was, it almost had everything come tumbling down around it because of this one incident. New Jack would actually be arrested for this, and something that New Jack had a bit of a knack for was staying out of deep trouble. He'd get into trouble, but he wouldn't really face consequences for those actions. He kind of made a career of it. This was due in part to the fact that the police discerned that the Cullises had lied about age and experience to Booker and owner Paul Heyman. Just for a bit of backstory as well, some 3 years later, New Jack would actually face a trial based on these events. He was forced into trial on charges of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. He would later be acquitted of all charges after the jury heard that Cullis was the one who told New Jack to get him to get colour. There was also a civil trial against New Jack as well, but he was declared not liable for that too. But that was 3 years later. We're talking about 1996, and everything that happened during the mass transit incident would put Extreme Championship Wrestling into dire jeopardy. You see, ECW was about to broadcast its first ever pay-per-view event. This is a big deal for wrestling companies, especially at the time. Request TV was going to be the provider of ECW Barely Legal. After the footage of the mass transit incident had made its way onto the internet, even in 1996, it found some form of virality. Request TV would actually catch wind of this and the subsequent backlash, and it would force ECW Barely Legal to be cancelled from pay-per-view. Heyman would have to beg and plead with Request TV for months before the company finally relented and allowed ECW to broadcast Barely Legal in April of 1997. If Barely Legal had never made it to broadcast, it's not actually clear whether or not ECW would have survived for as long as it actually did. Paul Heyman, despite his faults, absolutely loved ECW, and he wasn't going to let the ship sink any sooner than it needed to. In the end, this all just became a dark footnote in the history of ECW. Mass Transit, aka Eric Cullis, would unfortunately pass away at the heartbreaking age of 22. This was due to complications with gastric bypass surgery, so had really nothing to do with the Mass Transit incident. But New Jack, ever the tactful man that he was, did have one thing to say after learning about the death of Eric Cullis. I genuinely can't believe he said this. I mean, I can because it's New Jack, but still, it's still very hard to believe. He said, "I hope he rots in motherfucking hell, that fat bastard." He is quite the charmer, isn't he? At least he was. New Jack would pass away at the age of 58 in May of 2021. His death was caused by a heart attack, and with all the years of trauma and drug and alcohol abuse and obviously everything that he'd been through in his life, it all kind of caught up with him in the end. Following his death, Paul Heyman, at the end of a live broadcast of WWE Talking Smack, would have this to say. "When I heard that New Jack had passed away, my hope was that New Jack had turned to his wife and said, 'Hey, I'd like to read my own obituary. Call a bunch of people and tell them that I died. And then everybody's going to make a big fuss about it, and I'll read about my own life. And then at some point this weekend, they'll sell a bunch of t-shirts.'" And he'd sit there and go, "Gotcha." Because that's what New Jack would do. And apparently it's not so, which sucks. Usually we would pay tribute to someone here in WWE. We show a lot of footage of that person, and to be blunt, we can't show you a lot of footage of New Jack because he was the most non-PG performer in sports entertainment history. Because New Jack was a gangster. And everybody who was a fan of ECW, that came to see ECW, who watched ECW, knew that fact from the moment his music hit. And no, we never had the rights to use his music. Why? Because as an organization, we were gangsters. And New Jack was the most gangsters of all us gangsters. It's over 20 years ago, and anybody that ever saw New Jack perform live or heard him cut a promo understood just how real he was. Jerome Young was quite an individual. And deep in his heart, he was every bit of New Jack that he could offer you. I wish you all a most extreme weekend. Gangster style. Heyman would then throw his arms up in an X symbol. One in tribute to New Jack because it was something that he would do in the ring, and an X for extreme. Some do argue that the actions of New Jack that night in 1996 led to the death of Cullis. We'll never know if that is actually true, but one thing is definitely for sure. The only reason the mass transit incident became just a thing to begin with was because of a family emergency. If Axel Rotten had never got that call that night to go home because of a family emergency, he and Devon Dudley would have went out there and had that match against the Gangsters as normal, and it would have just been a bit of a footnote. ECW Barely Legal probably would have broadcast at the time it was supposed to broadcast. And maybe, just maybe, Extreme Championship Wrestling wouldn't have died the death that it did. While the eventual death of Eric Cullis is insanely sad and the actions of New Jack were just completely uncalled for, well, they say that any publicity is good publicity, so... And after all of that, ECW would just get bigger and bigger and bigger until the bills also got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the competition eventually outran them and left them behind. And that is the story of the mass transit incident. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. This is the first video on this channel. However, this isn't where the stories end. You can find Comfort in Death and Darkness on any platform that carries podcasts, except YouTube, because I haven't done that yet. But I would really appreciate everybody just going on Apple Podcasts or whatever and subscribing to the show, because I really like to put my heart and soul into these episodes. I will say all the episodes that I've done so far will be sort of like rehashed into these YouTube videos. This video right here will be made into a podcast episode, but it will be a lot darker and a lot more serious than this video was. But please subscribe to this channel. I'll be eternally grateful. Subscribe to the podcast, and don't forget, the shadows have the best story.